Hello, this is Lisa Harrison, and today is Tuesday, the 28th of February. And today I'm speaking with David Yurth. Now, David is a scientist, a writer, a lecturer, and facilitator of experiential workshops and seminars. He holds an associate degree in invertebrate marine zoology, a Bachelor of Science degree in literature and English, an MBA in organisational leadership. He's a PhD candidate in the field of cosmology. He's a seasoned senior executive, technology innovator, and holder of numerous patents. He has served on the boards of privately owned technology development companies and charitable organisations. He's a co-founder of the Nova Institute of Technology, the Global Innovation Alliance, Utah Injured Workers Association, and Third Rail Press. He is the co-author of the Y bias and angularity model of fine-scale physical interactions. He is currently working as chief scientist for Proteum Labs in Salt Lake City, Utah. He's married, lives with his wife Claudine and their two cats in Holiday, Utah. A musician, singer, songwriter. You play guitar, banjo, and the electric bass. Well, now that you've made me feel completely lazy.
Well, I had a head start on you, girl.
With all of that behind you, where do you see your primary passion and focus?
Well, I'm fundamentally interested in understanding what makes things work. And my job is to articulate what I think I understand so everybody else can understand it. So we come at that from as many different directions as we can.
And the book that I mentioned, the Y bias. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, this is the title of a scientific monograph that Don Ayers and I wrote and published open source on the internet in 2005. And the Y bias model attempts to provide an alternative model of how the cosmos works in contrast to the Big Bang Theory. And the reason we've gone through that exercise, one, we're very interested in understanding how that all came to be, if indeed there was any coming to be, or whether it's always been this way. Because our fundamental philosophy is that the model of physics you subscribe to has a dramatic impact on the way you view the universe and frame yourself in it. Mm-hmm. And as we talked the other evening, if your model of the physical world is incomplete or incorrect or misinformed, fundamentally flawed in some way, then the way you interpret your reason for being in the universe, your place in the cosmos, then also has to be fundamentally flawed. And we'd like to remediate that as much as we can for everyone.
Mm-hmm. For some years now, in the sort of metaphysical community, it's believed that quantum physics is the science that brings science and spirituality together. It explains metaphysics. Does this go even beyond the current understanding?
It does indeed. It does indeed. The model of science that is in current vogue, and the model changes from time to time, the model in current vogue is predicated on the notion that in the far distant past there was a singular event, which has been referred to now for 60 years as the Big Bang. A singular event in which all things primary that were going to be created in the cosmos were created in a single instant. Mm-hmm. Some 15 to 20 billion years ago.
Doesn't that also counteract evolution?
It really doesn't, but it ignores some fundamental principles that make nature work the way it does. Uh-huh. But the other thing that we suffer from is one of the other things we talked about the other night, and that is 250 years ago, a guy by the name of René Descartes made a turf deal with the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was still recovering, still licking its wounds after its encounters with Galileo and Copernicus. They conceded that the physical model of the universe as it had been constructed in Catholic doctrine was physically incorrect. They conceded the point and told Descartes and his gentleman friends, who called themselves naturalists, that they could observe and measure and quantify and experiment with the physical world all they wanted in any way they wanted, and the church would not interfere. On the proviso that all of what Descartes called the spirit stuff, the unseen, unknown, unmeasurable, unquantifiable stuff, remained the strict province of the church.
So Descartes got the five senses and the church got the sixth and everything else.
That is correct. And today, 250 years later, we are the heirs of a legacy which cuts scientific inquiry in half. It fundamentally prohibits the integration of the non-local, non-linear side of the equation, which is the realm in which consciousness operates. And so today, even today, this vaunted practice that we call science ostracizes and criticizes, disenfranchises serious credentialed scientists who spend their time and anybody else's research grant money doing serious investigation about the role of consciousness in the way nature works. That's still part of the world we live in. Everybody knows that there are things that happen in the mortal experience that go well beyond anything that the strict scientific model can accommodate. Nevertheless, that kind of information is not allowed to be considered with equal grace as other kinds of experimental information. And that's what's wrong with science.
Right. So hence you end up with people like Bruce Lipton, Greg Braden, who had scientific credentials and background, who end up becoming somewhat gurus in the metaphysical world, and ostracized to some degree from their previous peers.
Well, they're not alone. I mean, they're simply more recent, perhaps higher profile examples. But in the 50s and 60s, a man by the name of David Bohm intuited that there is an implicate order that contrives to evolve the entirety of the cosmos. His book was called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And because he wrote that book, he was summarily ejected from the mainstream scientific community. And he never regained his stature. And he's right. There is an implicate order, and it is inextricably interwoven into the fabric of the cosmos. We know something now about what that is, but it took 50 years for his information to catch up.
So does the Y bias take his work even further?
It does indeed.
So it brings the two worlds together, and where does that leave us in our understanding?
Well, let's frame the answer by asking a corollary question. If your model of physics is based on the presumption that when it thunders, the gods are angry, that exerts a profound effect on how you interpret what happens in the world and how you can manage it or how you would respond to it. Well, 2,000 years ago, that was the model that operated. Today, the model operates in the context of the Big Bang, which says that everything that matters was all created 20 billion years ago, and the universe in its entirety, in its extraordinary infinite distances, is not infinite, and in fact is grinding its way down to another cold start where everything is in entropy. Well, what does that do to your notion about your place in the cosmos? If there was a finite beginning, what does that do to the concept of timelessness? What, in fact, does it do to the concept of time itself? So, if that's your model, how do you frame your notions about your mortal experience? Did you make the choice to come here before you got here? Is there anything for you after you leave here? Is this a one-trick pony? Or do you get to do it over and over till you get it right?
There's a sense of pointlessness about it, that's for sure.
There is. It's as nihilistic as it can possibly be, and it demonstrates in the most profound way the Western scientific mind's incapacity for accommodating the very concept of infinity. Everything is based on a reductionist model. In the Big Bang model of the universe is a clockwork mechanism, and if you can break it down into its finest constituent pieces, the finest individual atom, as they say in the Greek tradition, then you'll understand what the universe is and everything about how it operates, and there'll be nothing left to be discovered. And by the way, that has nothing to do with consciousness, because consciousness is just a product of physical complexity.
But didn't they even prove that to themselves to be incorrect when they looked at the atom and went, hang on, there's even more here?
Oops. One of the things that we predicted in the Y-bias model in 2005 is that self-similarity, that is what science calls supersymmetry, where in each scale, things of a certain scale demonstrate self-similarity, that there's symmetry at all scales. 2 years ago, in Science magazine, a monster article about this revolutionary new discovery that, oh my goodness, at the finest scale of the subatomic particles of the atom, they know now for sure that there is supersymmetry operating at that scale. Brand new discovery.
So why wasn't your work in the Y-bias accepted that way?
I'm not at MIT. I'm not an emeritus professor of anything. I'm not part of mainstream science. I publish scientific articles. I present at scientific conferences. I'm a peer reviewer of scientific journals and publications, but I'm not part of the mainstream because I'm a heretic. Thank goodness.
Yeah, I was going to say by choice. Yeah.
Thank goodness. Heresy is my cup of tea. So, in the context of the big question, how does nature work? In the Y-bias model, we clearly establish that not only is there no such thing as the Big Bang is not a fact. It's just an idea. And it's not a very good one, we find out. It's an indefensible idea. In order to propound and defend the Big Bang notion, you have to at first violate every sacrosanct rule in the bag. You have to violate all the rules in order for it to happen, and then you have to make up a whole new set of special rules in order to allow it to do what people think it did. It's silliness. It's not good science.
So why has it been embraced the way it has been?
Look at the way science works. Science is the 11 blind men trying to describe an elephant. Is there? I mean, one team of scientists with a very special focus goes out and does a whole bunch of work, and they have all these very interesting findings, and they throw that up on the wall. And at the same time, a bunch of other scientists with a very different bias go out and do a bunch of experiments and throw that up on the wall. And after 100 years, we've got this wall plastered with all these ideas with a whole bunch of really weird underlying rules, some of which work and some of which don't. And everybody then stands back and says, well, okay, how do we connect the dots? Well, there's a whole bunch of those dots that just don't fit.
So they just leave them to one side for a minute?
Ignore them.
Oh.
They disenfranchise them. They call them anecdotal. Oh, my Lord. That's the worst thing you can call scientific evidence, is anecdotal. So, what about those things that happen in the human experience that are now so ubiquitously documented as to be undeniable? Start at the low end of the scale. Look at Raymond Moody and Kenneth Ring and 35 years of work in the near-death experience, more than 8 million documents, papers, memoirs, books published, available as part of the database of anecdotal information about the near-death experience. And you graduate from that to the recent work of impeccable scientists like Brian Weiss, who by accident discovered and by scientific inquiry have now illuminated more than 200,000 cases of impeccably conducted, impeccably documented instances where patients undergoing regression analysis or regression therapy report prior lives. And that documentation is so good that in cases where the prior lives have been within the last 100 or 200 years, private investigators hired by Brian Weiss have been able to go to locations where those people said they lived and find artifacts with their names on them. Physical evidence.
So when stuff like that comes up, is there still pressure from the Vatican are they still applying pressure to not go there? Or is it an old agreement that they've forgotten about?
No. No, the Catholic Church still views itself as the arbiter of salvation for all of mankind, entitled by fiat, by Peter himself, to intercede on behalf of every mortal being before they come, while they're here, and after they leave, in order to make sure they get their bingo card punched properly. Right? And this business about past lives, about the near-death experience, books like Journey of the Soul by Michael Newton, another impeccable scientist, who now has figured out, based on the interviews he's done for 35 years, nearly 10,000 cases published in 5 books, not only do we have prior existence, there's very specific things we do between mortal experiences. We know what that is. We know what happens before we come and after we leave, and what happens before we come back. That's not part of the scientific model.
No, clearly.
It's not part of the scientific model. So in 1975, the Eyring Research Institute went to Holland, went to Amsterdam with their video cameras. And they took footage under controlled conditions of a room full of children with a tutor bending spoons with their consciousness. Spoon bending on a grand scale. It's a matter of record. There's not a single tenet of the standard physical model that accommodates that occurrence. It is not allowed.
Does the Y bias accommodate that?
That's your life, it does. We not only explain what it is, but how it occurs.
So clearly you're up against mainstream academia in terms of getting this more widely acknowledged.
We are. We know that.
What headroads have you made so far?
In 2005, by the end of the year, if you used a search engine like Google or Yahoo to look up Y bias and angularity, you'd get about 250 hits. If you Google that search term today, you get, depending on how you frame it, you get between 5.25 and 7.5 million hits. The Y-bias model is being used and quoted and referred to in scientific papers, in conferences, in proceedings, in research work that's being published all over the world. And we continue to get unsolicited third-party validation for parts of the model all the time from people all over the planet. A wonderful thing is happening. Anytime the institution becomes more important than the purpose it was intended to serve, the institution goes through an evolutionary cycle that eventually results in its demise. Modern science, as we know it, is already in decline. And something wonderful is replacing it. The notion of unbiased, unfettered inquiry has now taken firm root in consciousness. I participate in 6 groups of disenfranchised heretical scientists, all of whom are credentialed by accredited institutions, all of whom realize that the standard model that describes the physical world is fundamentally flawed, and all of whom are dedicated to the proposition of finding out how to fix it, finding out what's really true, not getting caught up in defending what is doctrinal. So,
are they still working within academia?
Many of them are. Some of them haven't come out yet.
They're tinkering away in their backyard labs.
They are.
Yeah.
They are. Smart people find a way.
So I know when we talked the other day, I asked you the question, what technology do you see evolving? And I know that you don't know what you don't know. You can't foresee the unforeseeable. But I'm assuming that there also are some definite uses for this. So what do you see as the most useful or immediately accessible or creatable at this point?
Well, we have the means at our disposal now to do all sorts of things that people think they've been searching for years. For example, there are enough geothermal outlets on the surface of the planet to provide more than enough electrical power to satisfy the world's needs for electricity through the life expectancy of the planet without ever burning another ounce of coal or another milliliter of petroleum. Period. Harnessing geothermal energy has all sorts of interesting implications. In Iceland, they've pioneered all sorts of wonderful technologies because they sit on top of a volcanic fault. They can heat up as much water as often as they want. And they're doing really interesting things to convert that high temperature geothermal energy into electricity and other kinds of work functions. Most of the world's deposits of geothermal energy are below the boiling point. And because the interest of industry is served by using existing technology based on steam turbines to generate electric power, low temperature geothermal that won't boil water is of no use. Mm-hmm. Well, we've developed a system that converts low temperature geothermal or any temperature, ambient temperature source between 120 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit, anywhere from 30 to 90 degrees centigrade. We can convert that into electric power. We can perform work functions, never burn a drop of fuel, never have a piece of exhaust at all. Why isn't that happening? Well, because that constitutes a shift in focus and agenda, right? I mean, we have the technological means to solve all kinds of problems. We're not using them because so much money is being made exploiting the problem that the guys who are making all that money don't want the problem solved.
No. But here we
Right?
are in a situation now where we've got massive revolt against the financial system in countries
Right.
all over the world, and
Right.
people are going around the fiat system. They're bringing in bartering systems. They're finding
They are.
alternatives.
They are.
So they're not trying to fix this broken system. They're just ignoring it and creating a new one. Can you see the same thing happening with enough people getting to a point where they just want to refuse to support the oil industry and working amongst ourselves to get this up and running?
Well, let me give you two answers. The first answer is, in terms of financial operations, look at what's happened with microlending. See, microlending steps completely out of the box.
Mm.
It's not based on collateral. It's not based on security. It's not based on anything except honor and promises. And it has the lowest international default rate of any monetary undertaking in the history of the planet since money was invented. Because the people who have found access to that kind of support realize that if they don't keep their word, they'll lose their opportunity to thrive. They'll lose their opportunity to thrive. It's not about survival for them anymore. It's about thrival.
Mm.
And it's tribal. You see, it's the tribe that makes it work, and it's the women in the tribe that make it work, not the men. And do you know how they made it go? They made it go with cell phones.
How so?
Because in these remote villages in India, where microlending began, there were no communications facilities available at all. And so the people who did the microlending put one cell phone in each village in the hands of one matriarch who was responsible for making sure that the money got used the way it was supposed to and got repaid when the crops came in. And with a cell phone in their hand, they then had the ability to step out of the box and communicate directly with Source. And the world beat a path to their door. Now, women in India, untrained women, are now the engineers of self-sustaining energy production. In northern India, a team of women now train other women how to build photovoltaic panels and install them and use them so they are no longer reliant on the power distribution system that's supplied by the country. They're not held hostage.
I did see the documentary on that. It was amazing.
They're not held hostage anymore.
What's the university that kicked that off? There was the
Darned if I remember.
Barefoot.
Barefoot?
I think it was Barefoot University.
I don't remember that detail, but I was so taken by the idea. Well, if you look at that model is now being repeated in extraordinary ways all over the world. People are taking matters into their own hands and finding ways to use technologies that are very novel, that change the distribution model, that disenfranchise fiefdoms and control, that make it possible for them to exercise conscience in their dealings with each other. And it allows them to be tribal again.
Actually, the university itself is another brilliant example. I mean, if you have academic qualifications, they don't want you. You need to have real-world life skills to be a teacher there.
Go figure.
And it's an extraordinary place.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's awesome, isn't it? It's really, truly awesome. There's a flip side to that equation. So, and this is what we were talking about, the law of unintended consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
We did some work with UNESCO about 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, and during that time frame, UNESCO had been allowed to make a grant of up to $380 million to Liberia, specifically earmarked for the purpose of improving quality of life in the more than 2,500 orphanages that operate there. Well, Liberia has no infrastructure. No water infrastructure, no power infrastructure, no sewage infrastructure, no infrastructure of any kind. It's broken. It just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so orphanages have become entirely dependent on food aid, prepackaged food aid, and bottled water. There's no sanitary systems, and there's no refrigeration. They can't store food. They can't grow food. They have no water. They have no seed. Even if they could water, they can't make it work because they can't save the food because they don't have power. So we devised a set of 3 kinds of playground equipment made out of commonly available materials, a teeter-totter that runs 2 water pumps that will bring water up under pressure from 90 feet under the ground just when kids teeter-totter up and down,
That's brilliant.
a merry-go-round that is a power generator, so you spin that baby around and it makes electricity, and a swing set that operates with some cams and some gears and old spare tires on wheels. Once you get them spinning, as the pendulum goes back and forth, it keeps the wheel spinning. The wheel then is attached to a generator. The generator makes power. Okay? You can build them out of commonly available materials. You can install them. Any damn fool with a wrench and a hammer can install them. You put a couple of Edison batteries inside the orphanage, and it gives the children something to do that pumps water, filters water, stores water, refrigerates, provides lighting, powers laptop computers and cell phones, and gives them the ability to become self-sustaining. Well, one of the fellows I was working with decided he was going to get heroic, and he rolled out the drawings one day, and somebody from Liberia saw them and stole them. A year later, in a meeting with a guy who runs an NGO in Liberia, I discovered that those systems are being built and deployed all over Liberia. And what happened, instead of improving the lives of orphans, we learn that the people who run the orphanages are beneficiaries of grants provided by other non-governmental organizations that are intended to be well-being stipends per child per quarter. And because those technologies make it possible for the orphanage owner to have more children and get a bigger stipend, the rate of child trafficking in Africa escalated off the scale. So those 2,500 orphanages now house 250,000 children.
So they're just being abducted from their families and put into these orphanages.
And the guys that run the orphanages are driving new blue Mercedes. So you got to be careful what you ask for, because unintended consequences always come into play. So if you look at communications technologies are going to change dramatically. A couple of things may happen. Based on the technologies that are available now, it is likely within the next 10 years that a new kind of technology, a fundamentally new kind of technology that operates in the same plane as consciousness, holographically, will replace terrestrial inline communications technologies that will make it possible for us to communicate instantaneously across vast distances as if no distance was there, with no time delay, and with virtually unlimited bandwidth. We know that technology is possible because, among others, we have built devices that operate that way. The Russians were the first. They did it in 1982. Anybody can find out about it. You go to the Google search and you just Google in M2 communications experiment.
If they did it 30 years ago, why hasn't it made it to market?
Well,
Who benefits from it not making it to market?
You tell me how many hundreds of billions of dollars in this spaghetti bowl of relationships called the communications industry get really sidetracked if nobody needs to buy their bandwidth, if nobody needs to use their fiber optic cable, if nobody needs to use their servers and switches, if nobody needs to subscribe to their service.
Mm-hmm.
It fundamentally disenfranchises one of the fundamental legs that hold the stool of the world economy up. Communications technologies are absolutely indispensable, and they're resulting in changes in the world that nobody contemplated, like the Arab Spring, driven by Twitter and Facebook. So that's going to happen. The day is coming in the not distant future when ambient energy, heat and sunshine, nothing like what people call zero-point energy, is required. Just ambient energy, heat and sunshine and wind and tides and other kinds of energy sources that operate in the planet are being converted to usable energy with increasing rates of efficiency. The time is not far distant when the inexhaustible supply of ocean water will be desalinated and pumped over the ridge to irrigate the vast deserts of the world in a way that will make it possible to provide virtually limitless food resources at virtually no cost. That is coming.
What does that do to the oceans?
Doesn't do anything to the oceans.
They're not ill-affected at all.
Doesn't change a thing, because once that water goes into the soil, it's returned to the atmosphere and goes back into the ocean where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
That's a perpetual, eternal cycle. What it does do is take the lid off basic natural limits to population increase. When food becomes no longer a limiting factor, population will increase.
I mean,
It's an
here in
unintended
Australia, this
consequence.
is a huge piece of land we have here,
Sure it is.
with 21 million people inhabiting
Right
the rim,
on the edge.
right on the edge.
Right on the edge.
Something like 85% of the population live within 50 kilometres of the coast.
Because that's where the water is.
And the rest of it, much of it, once you get past the farmland, is desert. And I can't even imagine how many people that we could not only house but feed with the land here.
You can bet that when those technologies become available, there will be a population increase. And the kind of conflict that that's going to create is really fundamental. If you look at world populations, look at where populations are increasing and the cultures within which they're increasing, and where populations are diminishing and aging, and where that is occurring. And you're going to find that those cultures are defined by religious beliefs that are always in conflict. So there's always a balance here. So we ask this question. I've written some books. We're getting ready to make some movies based on these books that ask the question, for example, if you could do away with petroleum as the only really available source of transportation energy, would you? Answer, of course I would. Second question, if you did, what would happen? A whole bunch of things that we've seen in the past and a bunch of stuff we never imagined.
What do you think would happen? What do you think would happen if we no longer needed fuel for transport?
Well, it would certainly exert a dramatic effect on the way the world works. wouldn't it? Because that's the second leg of the stool is energy. Energy held in artificial scarcity in order to drive profit and control and drive social engineering. When that is no longer possible, when people have access to energy resources that don't cost them anything, that don't pollute, that don't contaminate, that are limitless, how does that change the way we live? How does it change the way the planet works? Who's going to embrace that and who's going to resist it? And by what means?
Well, I have put thought into what happens if we end up with free energy. What does that what does that look like? So the first thing you've got, I mean, I heard a quote the other day that 70% of our incomes go out in the cost of energy in some form or another, whether it's directly through the cost of powering our own homes or embedded in the cost of every product we buy. So instantly everything becomes cheaper because the cost of manufacturing and transporting those products goes down dramatically. What happens then? Okay, we've got more money to play with. We buy more products.
Little people have more money.
Little people have more money.
Little people have more money.
And we buy more products. So the demand for those products goes up. You end up with more jobs. We've got more money to spend on luxuries. We have more holidays. So anything to do with tourism goes up. Again, more jobs.
Remember that every time part of the equation goes up,
something has to come
down. The other
down.
part of the equation comes down.
So what comes down?
Well, what comes down is the entire market structure of petroleum and coal in the world. What comes down is the entire distribution network that distributes fuel and electricity.
I don't see this as a downside personally.
Well,
except for the people who will be unemployed and need to be reestablished.
No, but look at what it does to the financial markets. If Shell Oil and its partners and people like Halliburton, who enjoy all kinds of special exemptions and immunity in order to artificially maintain their profit, if those companies were no longer solvent because nobody needed what they produce anymore, the economic consequences, if they happened in the only way such things can happen, as an avalanche, are utterly, absolutely, globally catastrophic.
How so? Spell it out for me.
Well, let's talk about a sand pile. Okay? We've all been to the beach. We've all played the game. You build a big pile, and you put a stick in the top of it, and everybody in turn slices a piece of it away. The objective of the game is to see who can take the last slice without knocking the stick out, without collapsing the pile. We've all played that game. In all the experimental evidence performed on sand piles, we learn that there's a certain point in time at which that aggregation of particles is no longer just a collection of sand granules. It actually becomes a system. It's a complex, open, self-organizing system, and at some point in time, adding one more grain to the top will create a catastrophic avalanche somewhere on the pile at some magnitude. The experimental model was created so that people could improve their predictive models, right? So they could learn how to predict what was going to happen when in a complex system. And what they discovered instead is that there's a set of rules that operate in sand piles that operate in common with every open, complex, self-organizing system in the cosmos. The effect is called self-organizing criticality. It's the heart of the Y-bias model. And it says that at a certain tipping point, when a threshold is breached, changes, big changes, happen very fast in the place where you can't predict, at a time that you can't predict, in a way and a magnitude that you can't predict. So when you drive your stick into the sand pile called burning gasoline for fuel, watch out, because there comes a time when that catastrophic avalanche is going to occur, and it's much bigger and much nastier and much more far-reaching than anybody anticipated. You've got to be careful what you ask for.
Okay, I'm being myopic, perhaps, but and I see the avalanche, but I don't see the catastrophic. I, I don't know.
Well,
Maybe I'm being idealistic, but
it depends whose hat you're wearing.
yeah. Well,
Right.
certainly not. If I
Well,
was.
if you work in the oil field, if you own refineries, if if you work in a coal mine, if you distribute natural gas, if you sell stocks and bonds that are based on those profits, I mean, there's an entire world of relationships that's built on the commodity and the function it performs. So you may change it, but you do so at your peril, and you better be careful about how you do it unless you want to create a bigger problem than you solve.
But then it does come down to the very financial structure that we have.
It does.
With that, there will always be this catastrophic avalanche, no matter which part of society we try to improve. If it comes down to this current financial model, so if we change the current financial model, that really allows for all these things to take place. But
It
that's going to
does.
have to come first, isn't it?
It is, and it in chaos is opportunity. If you can survive the chaos, and you're clever enough and resourceful enough to be able to find a way to make use of the potential possibilities created by the disorganization of normalcy, then you can do things that really work. I mean, in the history of Australia, the biggest dollars were made by people who learned how to exploit things until order was brought into the equation, right? It's like the Wild Wild West. And in some aspects, the Wild Wild West still operates. I mean, when Wall Street blew up the world economy in 2008, that didn't happen all at once. It happened because there were no adults in the room for 20 years. Right?
Yes.
Nobody was slapping anybody on the wrist, and so they just figured they could keep on doing it bigger and badder every time because there was nobody there to stop them. Unbridled greed is part of the capitalistic model. Capitalism operates without morality.
Yeah. So we really just have to clean house in that whole.
You don't have to do anything. It's already collapsing under its own weight.
It is.
It is.
I know. I've seen the. Have you seen the list of bankers who have resigned in the last week or so?
Well, look at the list of banks that are being closed again. Look at the list of things that have gone wrong in the world. I mean, entire sovereign nation economies are falling into the ocean. They're failing because the systems that have been used to govern them are fundamentally flawed. So we're going through a really wonderful and scary time.
Does the why bias accommodate, in the same sense of this, the analogy of the sand and the avalanche? We're at that point now with world consciousness. Something has broke the camel's back in terms of how awake or asleep that we've been for too many years, and this avalanche of awakening, we're in the throes of it right now. And it's happening in all sectors. People are waking up to the financial system. They are waking up to the way governments work. They are waking up to the corporatization of governments and of their own individual flesh. It's exploding. does the science explain that in any way?
Of course. Of course.
So
Look,
it was always going to happen.
look, it depends on whose model of the universe you buy
Well, yours.
to decide, what is your place in the cosmos and why are you here, right? How did you get here? Where'd you come from? Where are you going? All those big questions. Well, look, one of the things that's happening is that the barrier which normally exists between the world of consciousness and the world of physicality is now being breached with increasing frequency. There are children being born now who have latent capacities that have only ever rarely been seen in the history of the world, but which are now in certain communities becoming commonplace.
Example?
We are, well, in China, for example. Okay. In China, there's a whole new generation of children who are capable of performing, of exerting the effects of willful consciousness on the physical world in ways that have only been dreamed of in the past. They're telekinetic. They're clairvoyant. They levitate. They communicate without speaking to each other. So, I mean, how strange is that? Well, it depends on whose frame of reference you use. Everybody is coded in their DNA with the latent capacity to do that because it's part of who we are. But for the longest time in most of the people, it has either been culturally or biologically bred out of the species. Well, that's not true anymore so much. And there's no longer the latent fear that operated during the days of the Inquisition. People don't buy the notion now that the only way to be safe in your being is to have somebody else intercede on your behalf with God. What's really true is there's nothing wrong with you. There never was anything wrong with you. In spite of the story you tell about yourself, there's nothing wrong with you, and you don't need anybody.
No, and today, if you exhibit those qualities, you'll be on the Oprah Winfrey Show and have a book deal.
Sure.
Some time ago, you would have been burnt at the stake as a witch.
That's right.
So things have changed dramatically.
They have.
Yeah.
They have, and in relatively speaking, in pretty dramatic fashion in a pretty short time.
But again, it is cultural. I mean, in some African countries, you would be deemed possessed, and somebody from the church would be sent out to exorcise you.
Get back to basics. If you go to first inhabitants, to primitive cultures, all of the paleontological work that's been done in the last 100 years teaches us one universally true thing about primitive cultures. The Aborigines of Australia are a prime example. In their history, we know that before their culture was corrupted, they lived in concert with nature in a way that enabled them to engage in communing with nature and using natural things to perform natural functions in the most natural, balanced way without destroying or defiling or contaminating their natural environment, because they always knew that they were part of the great chain of being. No better, no worse, no greater, no lesser. It's always true about the primitive cultures we encounter. There are very few of them left. But if you read the literature, that much has always been true. Well, we don't live that way anymore. I mean, you can't buy a vegetable that hasn't been genetically modified by somebody. You can't buy a quart of milk that doesn't already contain chemical pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer remnants and radioactive fallout and God knows what else. Nobody discloses that to you because it's not in the dairy industry's best interest to make those kinds of disclosures. It's not in the corn industry's best interest to tell you that high fructose is the cause of obesity and diabetes in 80% of the population in America. They're fighting that in court. They're resisting being compelled to make the disclosure. Science is being purchased to prove that it isn't so.
I love that. Science is being purchased.
Look, you can buy any kind of science you want.
Yeah.
And that's why so many credentialed scientists who are men and women of integrity are opting out of the system because it offends their fundamental goodness. If we can't use science for the benefit of others, there is no more dangerous undertaking in all of human history than science practiced without conscience.
Yeah,
and that's why we're discovering that people of my generation get to visit a kind of state of being that my grandson lives in all the time in just a couple of generations. I only get to go there just once in a while in my life because I'm all wired up to do all this other enculturated stuff that I inherited from my family and their family and their family. It's tough to shed that. It's very tough to shed it because the language you speak and the culture you operate in frame your options conceptually. You're only able to abstract things in a certain manner based on the languages you learn. And they preclude other alternatives. That's why diversity is so important. Because if you only have one language, you only have one frame of reference, and they're all fundamentally limited by definition.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a very interesting ball of wax.
That puts a new spin on the whole New World Order, one world, one language.
Absolutely does. Absolutely does. It's a catastrophic idea.
There is a utopian flip side to the one world paradigm. I mean, in my thinking at least, that we've been sold one version, which is the Prison Planet version. One currency, one language, one religion, and complete control.
And one set of values.
One set of values. I think it's very important, and I think that we absolutely have to, if we're going to survive, become one world, but certainly not that version of it. And not in the sense where we lose the cultural differences, because there's so much history and beauty in each culture. It'd be a shame to lose those.
Right.
But in the sense of, how can I put it? Patriotism and racism to me go hand in hand. They are the flip side of the same coin. But if that patriotism could be broadened beyond state or nation boundaries to include the whole planet and everybody in it. If you're going to be patriotic to your species and your planet. You
I
eliminate...
have a friend.
Yes?
I have a friend named Sheila, just retired after 30 years as a 5th grade school teacher. She forbade her students to participate in the Pledge of Allegiance to America, but taught them all the Pledge of Allegiance to the planet.
Nice.
And got herself in lots of trouble.
I bet.
All the time. And never gave in. She's a piece of work. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Look, Daniel Quinn really got it right. Are you familiar with his stuff?
Don't think so.
Anybody who hasn't read Daniel Quinn doesn't get it. Get his books. What Daniel Quinn does in his writings is in his first book, Ishmael, it's a Socratic dialogue between a keeper and a gorilla. And the gorilla asks the questions, and the keeper tries to figure out how to answer these Socratic questions, basically trying to figure out, how did we get in this mess in the first place? It's genius work. It took them 50 years to write it. It's right on the money. And the solutions are intrinsic to the question. So if you haven't read Daniel Quinn, you need to do so, because it informs the conversation. Mm-hmm. What Quinn says is that in the beginning, in our first people tribal mode, we lived and worked together in a tribal way, in an environment where people found their role naturally, and they worked together naturally, and they found food together naturally, and they thrived and did art together, and they painted, and they made pieces of art, and they made music, and they had a life. And at some point in time, somebody decided, after a couple of bad growing years, that you better figure out how to save some of this year's crop for next year, because you don't know whether the gods are going to be beneficent again. When that happened, when the food got locked up, when people couldn't have access to it, they then were constrained to change the way they lived from a point of authenticity to a point of subservience. They were forced to engage in behaviors that satisfied the agendas of the food keepers and not their own. Mm-hmm. The story that is told about those who keep the food is the same story we tell today. That story hasn't changed. And the resistance and the conflict remains the same. That hasn't changed. So if you're going to be safe for tomorrow, you have to find a way to deal with the exigencies of survival. And if you can find a way to do that without becoming subservient to someone else's control, that's what we strive for. Today we all spend our lives working for somebody else.
That one little thing has so many implications.
Of course it does.
Scarcity consciousness, subservience, not living in the moment, being constantly in the past or the future.
Walt Disney made a movie about it.
Which one?
You remember The Grasshopper and the Ant?
No.
The ants worked hard. They saved their food.
Ants, the movie Ants. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
And the grasshopper didn't bother. Well, when winter came, guess what happened? That's the story. Can the story change? Of course it can. But the guys who control the food stores, who control the banks, who control the money, who control energy, who control food, who control shelter, who control clothing, who control your access to the source of anything, including your spiritual source, all of that control has to be remediated into some other form. Otherwise, we remain not in our true, authentic self with a sense of well-being.
But that genuinely seems to be happening right this minute as we speak. We've got
there's
the
certainly
Vatican
a lot of
is
motion in that direction. Yeah.
The Vatican is hemorrhaging leaks about its financial dealings and other dealings. As we talked about earlier, we've got the banking system, everyone's jumping ship, all the CEOs. People coming out and being whistleblowers for the pharmaceutical industry.
Arab Spring.
I mean, we're in the midst of this avalanche that you talk about. It is awesome.
It's awesome. And because of it, we're getting traction faster and faster in a way that we never anticipated. And all of those who are participating in the process of rediscovering what is really true are to be congratulated and supported, because they're making the most profound change of all.
I mean, 20 years ago, did you see changes like this happening, and perhaps the science and the technology and the cultural changes being implemented in your lifetime? Did you ever think that was possible?
I'm a child of the 60s, girl. I'm a protest marcher.
Flower child.
And we had our shot and we screwed it up. And by the time I was 40 years old, I was suicidal, like a lot of my friends. We had our shot. We missed the target. We mistakenly believed that the way to change the world was to change what's out there. The way you have to change the world is to change what's in here. You got to be the change, not make the change. And that is happening.
And that's happening for a number of reasons too. Like you said, these new children that are coming through, they're coming through just that little bit differently.
They are. They're so smart. They're so smart. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you.
You too. You too. Lots to think about.
Well, let's do it again sometime soon. Every 10 years, whether we need it or not.
No, before that, I'm sure.
Hope so.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, you're certainly welcome.